In this video, we'll cover everything within the ecology topic, from how organisms compete and adapt in their ecosystems to the cycling of materials, human impacts on biodiversity, and how energy flows through food chains. This episode will look at key ecological terminology, how organisms compete for limited resources, the concept of interdependence, and finally, how changes to one species can cascade through an entire community. Let's start by defining the fundamental concepts that ecologists use to understand the natural world. Ecology is the scientific study of organisms, their environment, and the complex interactions between them. First, let's understand the precise terminology ecologists use to talk correctly about environmental issues. A habitat is the physical location where an organism lives and obtains all its requirements for survival and reproduction. Examples include tropical forests, coral reefs, Arctic tundra, freshwater lakes, and even the human gut where bacteria thrive. Each habitat provides specific conditions that determine which organisms can successfully survive and reproduce there. A population consists of all individuals of one species living within a particular habitat at a given time. For instance, all fish of a particular species in the sea. A community comprises all the different populations that interact within a habitat, forming complex networks of relationships. These species interact through feeding relationships, competition for resources, cooperation, and various other ecological connections that bind them together. Environmental factors are classified as either abiotic or biotic, a distinction that helps scientists understand different influences on organisms. Abiotic factors include non-living components such as temperature, light intensity, water availability, and many more factors. Biotic factors encompass all living components within an environment, including plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, and other microorganisms. These organisms constantly interact through predation, competition, mutualism, parasitism, and numerous other ecological relationships. An ecosystem combines the community with its abiotic environment, forming a functional unit where energy flows and nutrients cycle. Within ecosystems, organisms require specific resources for survival, growth, and reproduction. Plants need light for photosynthesis, space for their body to grow, water for metabolic processes, and mineral ions from soil for building proteins and other essential molecules. Animals require territory for living, hunting, and breeding, food for energy and growth, water for survival, and mates for reproduction. The availability of these resources directly influences population sizes, distribution patterns, and the overall structure of ecological communities. Since resources are finite in any environment, organisms must compete for them continuously. This competition for resources for survival occurs both within species, also known as intraspecific competition, and between different species, which is known as interspecific competition. In forest ecosystems, trees compete intensely for sunlight, extending their branches and leaves to capture maximum light energy. This competition creates a layered structure of forests with tall trees above, shade-tolerant shrubs in the middle, and specially adapted plants growing on the dark forest floor. Species better adapted to compete for specific resources will dominate their environment, whilst less competitive species may be forced to occupy different ecological niches, migrate elsewhere, or face local extinction. This influences population sizes in habitats. Beyond competition, interdependence exists between species for various services essential to survival, creating an intricate web of dependencies that maintains ecosystem stability through carefully balanced relationships developed over thousands of years of evolution. Plants depend on insects for pollination and animals for seed dispersal, whilst providing food, shelter, and oxygen in return. Decomposers like bacteria and fungi break down dead material, recycling nutrients that plants require for growth, completing the circle of life. These interconnections mean that changes to one species can trigger cascading effects throughout the entire community. Consider a stream ecosystem containing algae, larvae, and fish. Larvae serve as primary consumers, feeding on algae and controlling its growth whilst preventing harmful algal blooms. They also provide food for predators like fish, making them a crucial link in the aquatic food web. Without larvae consuming algae, algal populations may proliferate excessively, potentially creating blooms that reduce oxygen levels and affect water quality. This example illustrates how removing a single species disrupts the entire ecosystem balance profoundly. Each change triggers further adjustments as the community attempts to reach a new equilibrium, which may be very different from the original stable state. Some communities achieve remarkable stability despite constant small fluctuations in population sizes. Stable communities maintain relatively constant population sizes through balanced predator prey relationships, cooperation between species, and balance with environmental factors. These systems demonstrate remarkable resilience to minor disturbances whilst maintaining their overall structure and function over time. By studying these complex interactions, we gain insights into maintaining biodiversity and ecosystem health. Next time, we'll examine living and non living factors in more detail. This episode of the series covers the differences between abiotic and biotic factors, how these factors affect different organisms and populations, and how they combine to create complex ecosystems. Let's start by examining the non living components that shape life on Earth. Abiotic factors are the non living, physical, and chemical components of an ecosystem that determine which organisms can exist in particular environments. Key abiotic factors include moisture levels in soil and air, which influence water availability for all organisms. Light intensity determines photosynthesis rates in plants and affects animal behavior patterns. Temperature influences metabolic rates, enzyme function, and activity levels across all living things. Carbon dioxide levels are crucial for plant photosynthesis, whilst oxygen levels determine survival for aquatic animals. Wind intensity affects seed dispersal, pollination, and physical stress on organisms. Finally, soil pH and mineral content, particularly nitrate deficiency, directly influence plant growth due to inefficient protein synthesis. These factors determine which plant species can thrive, subsequently affecting entire food webs built upon plant producers. Changes in abiotic factors can trigger profound ecosystem responses. Consider what happens when light intensity decreases due to prolonged cloud cover or canopy closure. Reduced light intensity limits photosynthesis rates in plants, decreasing their energy production. This leads to slower growth rates, reduced reproduction, and potentially declining plant populations. The effects cascade through the ecosystem as herbivores lose food sources and shelter. Predator populations subsequently decline as their prey becomes scarce, demonstrating the interconnected nature of ecosystem responses. Biotic factors represent the living components and their interactions within ecosystems. These factors include all the ways organisms influence each other's population and community sizes. Predation is a fundamental biotic factor, with predators controlling prey populations whilst depending on them for survival. The introduction of new predators can dramatically alter community dynamics, sometimes leading to population crashes or extinctions. Competition occurs when organisms require the same limited resources. This competition can be intraspecific between members of the same species or interspecific between different species occupying similar ecological niches. Consider red and gray squirrels inhabiting the same woodland. Both species compete for similar food sources and nesting sites, with the better adapted species typically dominating over time. Pathogens represent another crucial biotic factor, causing diseases that can decimate populations. Historical data often shows dramatic population crashes following pathogen introduction. A population increasing steadily might suddenly plummet when disease strikes, taking years or decades to recover to previous levels. Food availability directly controls population sizes, as organisms cannot survive without adequate nutrition. Changes in food supply, whether through environmental changes or species interactions, immediately affect dependent populations. The interaction between living and non-living factors creates particularly complex ecosystem dynamics. Temperature changes might favor certain pathogens, whilst rainfall patterns influence plant growth and subsequent herbivore populations. These interactions make ecosystem responses difficult to predict, but fascinating to study. By understanding how abiotic and biotic factors interact, ecologists develop conservation strategies to protect vulnerable ecosystems. This scientific understanding guides management decisions for maintaining biodiversity and ecosystem services essential for human well-being. This episode in our series explores what adaptations are, their three main types, specific examples in animals, and extremophiles. Let's start by understanding what adaptations are and how they develop. Adaptations are inherited characteristics that increase an organism's chances of survival and reproduction in its environment. These features develop over many generations through natural selection, where beneficial traits become more common in populations. Scientists classify adaptations into three main types, each serving different survival functions. Structural adaptations involve physical features of an organism's body, including shape, size, and coloration. These anatomical characteristics directly influence how organisms interact with their environment. Arctic foxes exemplify structural adaptation through their seasonal color changes. Their white winter fur provides essential camouflage against snow, helping them avoid predators whilst hunting prey effectively. In summer, their coat turns brown, matching the tundra landscape. Temperature regulation requires different structural adaptations depending on climate. Cold adapted animals like whales possess thick blubber layers and low surface area to volume ratios, minimizing heat loss. Conversely, desert animals such as camels have thin fat layers and high surface area to volume ratios. These features maximize heat dissipation, preventing overheating in extreme temperatures. Behavioral adaptations involve actions organisms take to enhance survival. Migration represents a crucial behavioral adaptation for many species. Swallows travel thousands of kilometers seasonally, following food availability and suitable breeding conditions. These behavioral patterns can be instinctive or learned, including feeding strategies, predator avoidance, and social interactions. Each behavior increases survival probability in specific environmental conditions. Functional adaptations are internal physiological processes that enhance survival. These include metabolic adjustments, reproductive strategies, and biochemical mechanisms that help organisms cope with environmental challenges. Desert animals demonstrate remarkable functional adaptations for water conservation. They produce minimal sweat and highly concentrated urine, reducing water loss dramatically. These physiological adjustments allow survival in environments where water is extremely scarce. Hibernation represents another functional adaptation, particularly in brown bears. During winter, they dramatically reduce their metabolic rate, conserving energy when food is unavailable. This metabolic slowdown allows bears to survive months without eating, relying on stored body fat. Heart rate and breathing decrease significantly, reducing energy requirements to minimal levels. Microorganisms display the most extreme adaptations, with some species thriving in conditions lethal to most life forms. These extremophiles have revolutionized our understanding of life's limits. Some bacteria flourish in volcanic vents exceeding 100 degrees Celsius, temperatures that would denature most proteins. Other extremophiles inhabit hypersaline lakes with salt concentrations several times higher than seawater. They've evolved special mechanisms to prevent cellular dehydration in these extreme conditions. Deep sea bacteria survive crushing pressures that would destroy most organisms. Their adapted proteins and cellular structures function normally under pressures thousands of times greater than at sea level. Studying adaptations provides crucial insights into evolutionary processes and biodiversity. Each adaptation represents millions of years of evolutionary refinement, perfectly matching organisms to their ecological niches. This knowledge becomes increasingly important for conservation efforts and ecosystem management. By understanding how organisms adapt, we can better protect vulnerable species and maintain ecological balance. In this episode, we'll begin by examining food chains. Next, we'll trace energy movement through feeding relationships. And finally, we'll take a look at predator prey relationships. Let's begin with the fundamental concept of food chains. A food chain is a linear sequence that shows how energy and nutrients pass within an ecosystem from one organism to another through feeding. All food chains begin with organisms capable of producing their own food, known as producers. These organisms form the essential foundation of all life on Earth by creating biomass from inorganic substances. Producers, typically plants or algae, manufacture glucose through the process of photosynthesis. This remarkable biochemical process converts light energy from the sun into chemical energy stored in glucose molecules. When plants produce glucose, some is used immediately for respiration to release energy for cellular processes. The remainder gets converted into other biological molecules such as starch, cellulose, and proteins that build the plant's structure. These molecules collectively form what scientists term biomass, the total mass of living material in an organism. Biomass represents stored chemical energy that originated from sunlight captured during photosynthesis. This energy transfers through the ecosystem when one organism consumes another, though the transfer is never completely efficient. At each stage, substantial energy is lost through respiration, movement, and heat production. Primary consumers are herbivores that feed directly on producers. These herbivores, such as rabbits, deer, or caterpillars, obtain their energy by consuming plant material. They convert plant biomass into animal biomass through the processes of digestion. Primary consumers subsequently become food for secondary consumers, which are carnivores that feed on herbivores. Secondary consumers may then be consumed by tertiary consumers, creating additional levels in the food chain. The numbers of organisms at each level demonstrate the inefficiency of energy transfer. Consider this simplified example of numbers. Thousands of plants might support hundreds of caterpillars, which in turn could sustain tens of small birds, and that may support one eagle. We must now examine the dynamic relationship between predators and prey. Predators are animals that capture and consume other animals, whilst prey are the animals being consumed. In ecosystems containing both predator and prey species, population dynamics follow predictable patterns. These populations don't remain constant, but instead fluctuate in regular cycles that maintain ecosystem balance. Initially, prey populations are typically limited by the availability of their food resources. When conditions are favorable and food is abundant, prey populations can increase substantially. As prey numbers increase, predators have access to more food, which improves their survival and reproduction rates. Consequently, the predator population begins to grow in response to this increased food availability. However, as predator numbers rise, they consume increasing quantities of prey. This increased predation pressure causes the prey population to decline significantly. With fewer prey available, predators face food scarcity, which leads to reduced predator survival and reproduction, causing their population to decrease. As predator numbers fall, predation pressure on prey diminishes, allowing prey populations to recover. This recovery of prey numbers eventually provides more food for predators, initiating another cycle. The process continues indefinitely, creating fluctuations in both populations. Significantly, these population cycles are not synchronized but show a characteristic time lag. Changes in prey population are followed by corresponding changes in predator population after a delay. This delay occurs because population responses require time to manifest. When prey numbers decline, predators don't immediately disappear as they can survive temporarily on reduced food or stored energy reserves. Understanding food chains and predator prey relationships enables ecologists to predict ecosystem responses to environmental changes. This knowledge proves essential for effective conservation strategies and ecosystem management. In our next episode, we'll examine how materials like carbon and water cycle through ecosystems, returning to the environment for reuse by living organisms. In this episode in our series, we'll examine how materials cycle through ecosystems. Then we'll dive into the water cycle. Next, we'll take a look at the carbon cycle. And finally, how these cycles create interdependence between all living things. All materials in the living world undergo constant recycling through natural processes, ensuring the continuation of life on Earth. Without these cycles, essential materials would become permanently locked away and unavailable for use by living things. Every living organism requires specific materials to survive, grow, and reproduce. Plants need water, carbon dioxide, and mineral nutrients, whilst animals require water, oxygen, and organic nutrients obtained from their food. The source of these materials lies in Earth's remarkable natural cycles. Let's examine the water cycle, which represents the continuous movement of water throughout our planet. The water present on Earth today has been recycled countless times over geological history. The total quantity of water on Earth remains essentially constant over time. However, this water continuously changes form and location through various physical and biological processes. The water cycle begins when solar energy causes water to evaporate from oceans, lakes, rivers, and soil surfaces. This process transforms liquid water into water vapor, which enters the atmosphere. Plants contribute to this process through transpiration, where water absorbed by roots moves through the plant and exits through stomata in leaves. Together, evaporation and transpiration add substantial quantities of water vapor to the atmosphere. This warm water vapor rises through the atmosphere due to its lower density. As water vapor ascends to higher altitudes, it encounters cooler temperatures, causing it to condense into droplets. These droplets aggregate to form clouds, which can transport water over considerable distances. Eventually, when water droplets within clouds become sufficiently large and heavy, they fall as precipitation. This precipitation may take the form of rain, snow, or hail, depending on atmospheric conditions. This precipitation provides the fresh water essential for terrestrial life. Without this continuous supply, land-based organisms could not survive, as ocean water contains salt concentrations toxic to most terrestrial species. Once precipitation reaches land, it follows various pathways back to the ocean. Some water infiltrates the soil to become groundwater, where plant roots can absorb it for photosynthesis and other metabolic processes. Other water flows across the surface as runoff, forming streams and rivers that eventually drain back into seas and oceans. This completes the cycle, allowing the process to begin again. The water cycle is critical because only approximately 3% of Earth's water exists as fresh water. Much of this fresh water remains frozen in ice caps and glaciers, making it unavailable for immediate use. The continuous cycling ensures that the limited liquid freshwater remains accessible for living organisms. Now we must examine another fundamental cycle, the carbon cycle. Carbon atoms form the backbone of all organic molecules, including carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. Plants absorb elements like carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen from their environment. They convert these simple inorganic substances into complex organic compounds that constitute their biomass. These materials pass through food chains as organisms consume one another. Eventually, all materials return to the environment through excretion, death, and decomposition. The carbon cycle is particularly significant for maintaining life on Earth. Carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is absorbed by plants and algae during photosynthesis. This carbon becomes incorporated into glucose molecules, which can be converted into various organic compounds that form plant structures. When plants and algae respire, some carbon returns to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. This represents only a portion of the carbon they initially absorbed, as much remains in their biomass. When animals consume plants, carbon compounds transfer through the food chain from primary consumers to secondary and tertiary consumers. Each organism uses some carbon for respiration, releasing carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. When organisms die, decomposers and detritus feeders break down their remains. These microorganisms respire as they feed, releasing carbon dioxide and completing this portion of the cycle. Animals also produce waste products containing carbon compounds. Decomposers break down this waste material, returning carbon to the atmosphere through their respiration. Human activities, particularly burning fossil fuels, have significantly increased atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. This represents an acceleration of carbon release that would otherwise occur over geological timescales. In stable ecosystems, materials removed from the soil by plants are balanced by those returned through decomposition. This equilibrium maintains nutrient availability and sustains ecosystem productivity over time. These cycles, though conceptually straightforward, are absolutely vital for life's continuation on Earth. Without them, essential materials would become depleted, causing ecosystem collapse. This episode in our series will cover what decomposition is, how it produces compost, environmental factors affecting rate of decomposition, and how this process can provide a renewable source of energy. Decomposition is essential for maintaining the flow of nutrients through ecosystems. Microorganisms break down plant and animal material to obtain energy for metabolism, energy that would otherwise remain locked in dead organic matter. The process of decay occurs continuously in natural environments worldwide. For example, in forests, fallen leaves decompose on the forest floor, and in gardens, organic waste breaks down in compost heaps. Compost is decomposed organic matter that can be used as a natural fertilizer for plants. It contains essential nutrients released during the decomposition process, making it valuable for improving soil fertility and structure. Farmers and gardeners manipulate environmental conditions to accelerate decomposition and produce high quality compost efficiently. The primary agents of decomposition are microorganisms, including bacteria and fungi, which secrete enzymes to break down complex organic molecules. Larger organisms called detritus feeders, such as woodlice and earthworms, also contribute by physically breaking down material into smaller pieces. These decomposers work together to convert dead organic matter into simpler substances. The smaller particles created by detritus feeders provide increased surface area for microorganisms to colonize and digest. Several environmental factors significantly influence the rate of decomposition. Understanding these factors allows us to predict decomposition rates in different environments and manipulate conditions for practical applications. Temperature is the first major factor affecting decomposition rate. Warmer temperatures generally accelerate decomposition because heat increases enzyme activity and weakens cellular structures in dead material. However, extremely high temperatures can denature enzymes essential for decomposition, whilst very cold temperatures dramatically slow the process. The optimal temperature range for most decomposers lies between 25 and 35 degrees Celsius. Outside this range, decomposition rates decline significantly, which explains why organic matter decomposes slowly in Arctic environments but rapidly in tropical regions. Oxygen availability represents another crucial factor in decomposition. Most decomposer organisms require oxygen for aerobic respiration, which provides the energy needed for breaking down organic matter. In oxygen-rich environments, aerobic decomposition proceeds rapidly and completely, converting organic matter into carbon dioxide, water, and mineral nutrients. When oxygen is limited, different microorganisms carry out anaerobic decomposition, which proceeds more slowly and produces different end products. Water availability also plays a critical role in decomposition processes. Decomposer organisms require water for their metabolic processes, including enzyme production and nutrient transport. Moisture also helps dissolve organic compounds, making them more accessible to microorganisms. Decomposition occurs most rapidly in moist environments, typically when water content is between 50 and 60% of the material's water holding capacity. Both excessive moisture, which can limit oxygen availability, and drought conditions significantly reduce decomposition rates. The abundance of decomposer organisms directly affects how quickly organic matter breaks down. Areas with diverse and numerous decomposer populations experience faster decomposition than those with limited decomposer communities. By manipulating these factors, humans can control decomposition rates for various purposes. Gardeners maintain optimal conditions in compost heaps by turning them regularly to provide oxygen, maintaining moisture levels, and sometimes adding materials to adjust temperature. Now we must examine biogas production through anaerobic decay. Biogas consists primarily of methane, which can be burned as a fuel for heating, cooking, or electricity generation. It's produced when organic material decomposes in the absence of oxygen through a process called anaerobic decay. Specialized anaerobic microorganisms break down plant and animal waste without oxygen, producing methane as byproduct. This natural process occurs in waterlogged soils, landfill sites, and the digestive systems of ruminant animals. Biogas production facilities at sewage treatment works and agricultural sites harness this process on an industrial scale. These facilities use specially designed containers called digesters or generators to optimize conditions for anaerobic decomposition. These digesters must maintain constant temperatures, typically around 35 degrees Celsius, to keep anaerobic microorganisms functioning efficiently. Temperature fluctuations can severely reduce methane production or halt the process entirely. Unlike natural gas, biogas cannot be stored as a liquid under pressure and must be used immediately. The immediate use requirement means biogas generators are typically connected directly to heating systems, cooking facilities, or electricity generators. This limitation affects how biogas systems are designed and implemented. Two main types of biogas generators exist: batch generators and continuous generators. Each type has specific advantages depending on the scale and consistency of organic waste availability. Batch generators process waste in discrete batches, with material loaded, left to digest completely, and then cleared before the next batch. These systems suit situations with periodic waste availability but require more labor to operate. Continuous generators receive constant waste input and produce biogas at steady rates. These systems work well for large-scale operations with consistent waste streams, such as sewage treatment plants or large farms. Understanding decomposition reveals the remarkable efficiency of natural recycling systems. Without decomposers, dead organic matter would accumulate indefinitely, and essential nutrients would become unavailable to living organisms. The continuous activity of decomposers maintains the flow of materials through ecosystems supporting all life on Earth. Humans have learned to manipulate decomposition processes for practical benefits, producing nutrient rich compost for agriculture and renewable energy through biogas generation. These applications demonstrate how understanding natural processes can provide sustainable solutions to human needs. We'll cover what environmental change means for living organisms, analyze three key environmental factors that determine species distribution, and consider the various causes of environmental change. Environmental changes alter the geographical ranges where species can maintain viable populations to live and reproduce successfully. These changes affect organisms differentially, causing some species to expand their ranges whilst others decline. Understanding these responses requires exploring specific environmental factors that limit species distribution. Water availability represents the first main factor influencing species distribution. all organisms require water for metabolic processes, though requirements vary considerably between species. Water availability often determines the boundaries of species' geographical ranges, particularly in dry regions. In tropical regions, species distributions shift predictably between wet and dry seasons. These seasonal rainfall differences create temporary changes in habitat suitability that determine distributional changes. The East African wildebeest migration demonstrates this phenomenon. Millions of individuals migrate northward once the dry season starts in the south. They follow rainfall patterns and resulting grass growth in the north, then return south when rains resume there. Temperature represents the second critical factor determining species distributions. Even modest temperature changes can substantially impact where species survive by altering habitat thermal suitability. Many species have narrow temperature tolerances that restrict them to specific climatic zones. Current climate warming causes observable distributional shifts worldwide. Rising average temperatures in Germany have enabled Mediterranean species to expand northward into previously unsuitable regions. The European bee-eater, historically restricted to Mediterranean areas, now breeds regularly in parts of Germany. This northward expansion directly corresponds to warming temperatures, making previously cold regions thermally suitable. Atmospheric composition constitutes the third important distributional factor. Different species exhibit varying sensitivities to carbon dioxide concentrations and air pollutants. Certain species demonstrate extreme sensitivity to air quality, making them valuable environmental bioindicators. Lichen species exemplify organisms highly sensitive to pollution levels. Different lichens exhibit varying pollution tolerances, with some thriving only in pristine air, whilst others tolerate moderate pollution. The absence of pollution-sensitive lichens from urban areas demonstrates how atmospheric composition controls distribution. Similarly, industrial processes affecting water chemistry cause sensitive fish species to disappear from polluted waters. Environmental changes occur through various mechanisms at different scales. Some changes represent natural variations to which species have adapted over evolutionary time. Seasonal variations create predictable changes that species exploit through migration, dormancy, or reproductive timing. Geographic differences across latitudes and altitudes create stable environmental gradients determining species distributions. These natural patterns have shaped species adaptations over millennia. However, human activities increasingly drive rapid environmental changes exceeding natural variation rates. Rising global temperatures, primarily from human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, force species to shift ranges towards the poles of Earth and upward in elevation. Many species cannot disperse quickly enough to track rapidly changing conditions. Others face dispersal barriers like urban development, preventing range shifts. These constraints lead to population declines and local extinctions when species cannot escape deteriorating conditions. Understanding how environmental changes affect species distributions helps scientists predict future biodiversity patterns and design effective conservation strategies. Efforts focus on maintaining habitat connectivity through protected areas and wildlife corridors, enabling species to move and adapt to shifting conditions. Monitoring species distributions provides early warning signals of environmental change impacts. By understanding how environmental factors control distributions, we can better predict and manage human impacts on biodiversity. In this episode, we'll cover what biodiversity is, how population growth increases environmental pressure through resource consumption, the growing global waste problem, and then consider strategies for protecting Earth's biological diversity. Biodiversity refers to the variety of different species of organisms on Earth or within particular ecosystems. This encompasses all forms of life, including plants, animals, fungi, and microorganisms. It also covers the genetic variation, which contributes to the complex web of interactions that maintains ecosystem functioning. Different species depend upon one another for food, shelter, and maintenance of suitable environments through complex networks of ecological relationships. This contributes to ecosystem stability and resilience. Consider how certain plant species modify soil chemistry, altering pH levels to create conditions suitable for other plants. Predators regulate prey populations, preventing overgrazing or resource depletion, whilst decomposers break down dead material, recycling nutrients essential for reuse by other organisms. These interconnected relationships create robust ecosystems capable of withstanding environmental changes. When ecosystems possess high biodiversity, they demonstrate greater resilience to disturbances. If one species declines due to disease or environmental change, other species can often compensate by performing similar ecological roles, maintaining ecosystem processes. This acts as ecological insurance, preventing ecosystem collapse when individual species face challenges. However, as biodiversity decreases, ecosystems become increasingly exposed to disruption. Human survival depends fundamentally upon maintaining significant biodiversity levels. We rely on diverse ecosystems for essential services, including food production, medicine development, climate regulation, and oxygen production through photosynthesis. Unfortunately, human activities are reducing biodiversity at unprecedented rates. A primary driver of biodiversity loss is rapid human population growth combined with increasing resource consumption. The global population now exceeds 8 billion people and continues rising, particularly in developing regions. Population graphs reveal dramatic exponential growth, especially during the 20th and 21st centuries. This growth trajectory places enormous pressure on natural resources and ecosystems as humans extract materials necessary for survival and development. When Earth's population remained relatively small, human environmental impacts were typically localized and ecosystems could recover. However, current population levels and consumption patterns create widespread environmental damage. Expanding human populations require increasing amounts of land for housing, agriculture, and industrial development. This expansion occurs primarily through habitat conversion, destroying natural ecosystems and displacing wildlife species. Population growth alone doesn't fully explain increasing environmental pressure. Global improvements in living standards mean individuals consume more resources than previous generations. People increasingly expect comfortable housing, lots of consumer goods, and high tech products. Meeting these expectations requires extracting raw materials, including fossil fuels for plastics production, metals for electronics and construction, and timber for various products. This accelerating resource extraction depletes natural resources faster than regeneration rates. Many critical resources face depletion if current consumption patterns continue. Non-renewable resources like fossil fuels and minerals cannot be replaced on human timescales, whilst renewable resources are being harvested beyond sustainable yields. This overconsumption generates another major environmental challenge: waste management. Increased production and consumption inevitably produce more waste, including hazardous chemicals requiring careful handling. Without proper waste management, pollution accumulates in ecosystems, damaging biodiversity and human health. Water pollution occurs through multiple pathways, severely affecting aquatic biodiversity. Sewage discharge introduces pathogens and substances that disrupt aquatic ecosystems, whilst industrial effluents contain toxic chemicals that bioaccumulate through food chains. Agricultural activities contribute significantly to water pollution through fertilizer runoff and pesticide contamination. These chemicals wash into rivers, lakes, and coastal waters during rainfall, affecting organisms far from application sites. Fertilizer runoff causes eutrophication, triggering algal blooms that deplete dissolved oxygen when decomposing. These conditions create dead zones where most aquatic life cannot survive, dramatically reducing biodiversity. Air pollution presents equally serious threats to biodiversity. Industrial processes and combustion release various atmospheric pollutants, including sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides. These pollutants directly harm organisms through respiratory damage and toxic effects. Sulfur dioxide emissions cause acid rain, which damages plant tissues and acidifies soils and water bodies. Acid rain particularly affects forests and freshwater ecosystems, causing species populations to decline and ecosystem degradation. Ground level ozone, formed through reactions between nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds, damages plant photosynthesis and reduces agricultural productivity. This affects both wild plant communities and crop systems supporting human populations. Land pollution creates persistent environmental problems affecting terrestrial biodiversity. Landfill sites concentrate household and industrial waste, potentially leaching toxic substances into surrounding soils and groundwater. Improperly managed landfills release methane, contributing to climate change and provide breeding grounds for disease vectors. Agricultural chemicals, including pesticides and herbicides, accumulate in soils, affecting soil organisms essential for nutrient cycling. These chemicals can persist for years, continuously impacting biodiversity and potentially entering food chains. Nuclear waste presents unique challenges, remaining hazardous for thousands of years. Despite underground storage, risks remain of contamination affecting future generations of organisms. These various pollution forms interact together, creating impacts exceeding individual effects. Multiple pollution sources reduce ecosystem resilience, making recovery increasingly difficult even when pollution sources are eliminated. Pollution directly reduces biodiversity through several mechanisms. Sensitive species die when exposed to toxic pollutants, creating gaps in food webs and ecological interactions. And non-deadly effects include reduced reproduction and increased disease sensitivity, gradually depleting populations. Habitat degradation through pollution makes environments uninhabitable for specialized species requiring specific conditions. Other species may increase, but overall species richness and ecosystem complexity decline. Recent decades have witnessed growing recognition of biodiversity's importance and threats it faces. Governments and organizations implement various conservation measures, including protected area establishment, endangered species programs, and habitat restoration projects. International agreements like the Convention on Biological Diversity coordinate global conservation efforts. Improved waste management practices reduce pollution impacts on biodiversity. Recycling programs decrease resource extraction and waste generation, whilst proper hazardous waste disposal prevents environmental contamination. Sustainable resource use strategies, including renewable energy adoption and sustainable farming, help maintain biodiversity whilst meeting human needs. These approaches recognize that human welfare depends upon healthy ecosystems. The future of biodiversity, and ultimately human civilization, depends upon transforming our relationship with nature. This requires fundamental changes in how we produce, consume, and dispose of materials. In this episode of our series, we'll explore how humans use land, investigate environmental impacts of deforestation, explore all the problems caused by this loss of trees, and why peat bogs are environmental superheroes. Humans use absolutely enormous amounts of land for countless different purposes. We need land for building homes and infrastructure, quarrying materials for construction, farming to produce food, and creating landfill sites for waste disposal. Essentially, we've turned Earth's surface into our personal, multi-purpose playground, leaving less room for other organisms. As our population grows and demands more resources, we claim increasingly more land for human activities. This expansion means other species must squeeze into ever smaller spaces. Sometimes our land use has particularly damaging environmental effects. This is especially true when it involves deforestation or the destruction of special habitats like peat bogs, nature's own carbon storing time capsules. Deforestation is the large scale cutting down of forests. While small scale managed tree harvesting can be sustainable, the massive destruction of forests, particularly tropical rainforests, causes serious environmental problems. Why does deforestation happen at such alarming rates? The primary reason is clearing land for agriculture, including cattle ranches and crop cultivation like soya beans, to feed our ever growing global population or crops for biofuel production. Forests are also harvested for timber used in construction, paper production, and various wood products. Unfortunately, deforestation causes multiple environmental problems. First, it dramatically reduces the amount of carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. Trees are nature's carbon vacuum cleaners, efficiently absorbing CO2 and using it to build their wooden structures. Trees lock up carbon in their wood, where it can remain stored for centuries. Think of them as biological carbon prisons. When forests disappear, we lose this crucial carbon capture system that's been working perfectly for millions of years. Additionally, burning trees to clear land releases stored carbon back into the atmosphere as CO2. It's like opening all the prison doors at once. Carbon that was safely locked away suddenly floods back into the atmosphere. Microorganisms decomposing dead wood also release CO2 through respiration. Even after the chainsaws stop, these tiny decomposers continue pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, making deforestation's impact long lasting. Another devastating consequence of deforestation is the loss of biodiversity. Forests, especially tropical rainforests, contain mind-boggling numbers of different species, from massive trees to tiny insects. When forests are destroyed, countless species lose their homes, and many face extinction, particularly those adapted to specific forest conditions. Imagine bulldozing an entire city and expecting all residents to just find somewhere else to live. That's essentially what we're doing to forest inhabitants, except they can't simply rent a flat elsewhere. Now let's explore peat bogs, nature's underappreciated carbon storage facilities. Peat bogs are waterlogged wetlands where dead plants don't fully decompose due to oxygen poor conditions. Instead of rotting completely, these plants accumulate over thousands of years, forming thick layers of peat. This process is incredibly important because carbon from dead plants gets stored in peat rather than released into the atmosphere. Peat bogs are essentially Earth's carbon savings accounts, holding more carbon than all the world's forests combined. However, humans drain peat bogs for farmland or dig up peat for fuel and garden compost. We're using peat much faster than it forms, and it's contributing to climate change. Draining peat bogs triggers a carbon catastrophe. Once exposed to air, microorganisms begin decomposing the peat, releasing stored carbon as CO2 through respiration. Burning peat as fuel releases even more CO2, whilst destroying these unique habitats eliminates countless specialized species. It's an environmental double whammy, increasing greenhouse gases whilst reducing biodiversity. Understanding these impacts helps us appreciate why sustainable land use matters enormously. Both forests and peat bogs play irreplaceable roles in regulating Earth's carbon cycle and supporting the incredible diversity of life on our planet. In this episode of our series, we'll explore global warming and its root causes, how greenhouse gases trap solar energy, identify the main types of these greenhouse gases, and finally, the consequences of warming our planet. Global warming is the gradual increase in Earth's average temperature caused by rising atmospheric greenhouse gas levels, and it's affecting weather patterns, sea levels, and ecosystems globally. To understand global warming, we must first grasp Earth's energy balance. Our planet's temperature depends on the balance between incoming solar energy and energy radiated back to space. Atmospheric gases act as Earth's insulating blanket. These gases absorb energy that would normally escape to space and re-radiate it in all directions, including back towards Earth's surface. This greenhouse effect keeps our planet approximately 33 degrees Celsius warmer than it would be otherwise, the difference between a habitable world and a frozen wasteland. Problems arise when greenhouse gas concentrations increase significantly beyond natural levels. The primary culprits are carbon dioxide and methane, both increasing sharply due to human activities. Carbon dioxide levels have risen primarily through burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas for energy. Deforestation compounds this problem by reducing Earth's capacity to absorb carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. Methane emissions come from livestock farming, rice cultivation, and landfill decomposition. This potent greenhouse gas traps heat far more effectively than CO2, though it persists for less time in the atmosphere. As greenhouse gas concentrations rise, more heat becomes trapped in our atmosphere, driving global temperatures upward. Even seemingly small temperature increases can trigger cascading effects throughout Earth's interconnected systems. The biological consequences of global warming are already becoming apparent worldwide. Rising temperatures melt glaciers and cause thermal expansion of oceans, raising sea levels that threaten coastal habitats where millions of species live. Species distributions are shifting dramatically as organisms track suitable climate conditions. Many wild animals and plants are moving towards the poles or to higher elevations, seeking cooler temperatures. Some species actually benefit from warming conditions. Warm adapted species expand into previously inhospitable regions, sometimes becoming invasive and disrupting existing ecosystems. Mediterranean species, for instance, now thrive in parts of northern Europe that were historically too cold. However, many species face range contractions as suitable habitats shrink. Cold adapted species have nowhere to go when mountains warm or polar regions heat up, facing potential extinction. Migration patterns are changing as animals adjust their movements to new climate realities. Birds arrive earlier at breeding grounds or travel further north, while some migrations are disappearing entirely. These rapid changes threaten global biodiversity significantly. Species unable to adapt quickly enough face local or global extinction, particularly species with narrow ecological requirements. Ecosystem disruption occurs as predator-prey relationships, pollination partnerships, and other ecological interactions become mismatched. Understanding global warming's biological impacts helps scientists predict future changes and develop conservation strategies. This knowledge proves essential for protecting vulnerable species and maintaining ecosystem services humans depend upon. In this episode of our series, we'll explore maintaining biodiversity, conservation programs designed to protect ecosystems, strategies to preserve habitats and species, and finally, look at why biodiversity conservation is facing challenges. Maintaining high biodiversity levels is crucial for ecosystem stability and resilience. Biodiversity helps ecosystems remain balanced and recover from disturbances. When biodiversity declines, ecosystems become vulnerable to collapse, potentially triggering cascading effects throughout the natural world. In response to alarming biodiversity losses, scientists and conservationists have developed numerous programs to protect ecosystems and their inhabitants. These initiatives range from small-scale local projects to international conservation efforts. Breeding programs represent one key strategy for preventing species extinctions. These programs serve as genetic insurance policies and involve breeding endangered animals in captivity, ensuring species survival even if wild populations disappear. Individual animals from breeding programs are often released into wild to boost declining populations or re-establish extinct ones. This approach has successfully rescued species like the California condor and Arabian oryx from the brink of extinction. Habitat protection and regeneration programs focus on preserving entire ecosystems rather than individual species. Protecting rare habitats like mangroves, heathlands, and coral reefs safeguards all organisms living within these environments, maintaining both species and ecosystem diversity. Agricultural landscapes also benefit from biodiversity enhancement programs. Many farms now reintroduce hedgerows and field margins around crops, where only single species are grown. Field margins are strips of land around field edges where wildflowers and grasses grow naturally, creating wildlife corridors. These features support far more organisms than could survive in single crop fields alone. Hedgerows provide nesting sites for birds, shelter for small mammals, and food sources for pollinators, significantly increasing agricultural biodiversity. Governments worldwide have introduced regulations to reduce deforestation rates, limiting habitat loss and carbon dioxide emissions. These policies aim to preserve forest ecosystems whilst addressing climate change, tackling two environmental crises simultaneously. Recycling programs reduce pressure on ecosystems by decreasing landfill requirements. When people recycle materials rather than discarding them, less land needs converting to waste disposal sites, preserving natural habitats. Unfortunately, maintaining biodiversity isn't as straightforward as implementing conservation programs. Numerous conflicting pressures complicate conservation efforts, creating difficult choices between environmental protection and human needs. These conflicts often pit short term economic gains against long term environmental sustainability. Financial constraints significantly impact conservation efforts. Governments must pay farmers subsidies to maintain hedgerows and field margins, compensating them for reduced crop yields from these areas. Employing wardens to monitor protected areas and enforcing regulations requires substantial funding. Limited budgets mean difficult decisions about which species or habitats receive protection. Economic interests frequently conflict with biodiversity protection goals. Conservation efforts can threaten local livelihoods, particularly in developing regions. Reducing deforestation protects biodiversity but may leave logging workers unemployed, creating social and economic hardship for communities dependent on forest resources. Food security concerns sometimes override biodiversity considerations. Farmers view certain wildlife as pests when they damage crops or livestock, leading to control measures that disrupt food chains and reduce biodiversity. Development pressures constantly challenge conservation efforts. Growing populations require housing, infrastructure, and agricultural land, often at the expense of natural habitats on urban fringes or in developing nations. Finding balance between environmental protection and human needs remains one of our greatest challenges. Success requires cooperation between governments, businesses, communities, and individuals, all working towards sustainable solutions. In this episode of our series, we'll explore what trophic levels are and how they organize feeding relationships, then examine each trophic level in detail, and finally, the role of decomposers in recycling nutrients. Trophic levels are essentially the different stages in a food chain, with each level containing organisms that share similar feeding strategies. Trophic levels are numbered sequentially, starting with level 1 at the base of the food chain. Each subsequent level is numbered according to its distance from the primary energy source, also known as producers. Let's examine each trophic level systematically. Trophic level 1 contains producers, organisms that form the foundation of all food chains. These include plants on land and algae in aquatic environments, both capable of manufacturing their own food through photosynthesis. Producers harness solar energy to convert carbon dioxide and water into glucose. They provide themselves with energy whilst building complex molecules for growth and are essentially biological solar panels, converting light energy into chemical energy that powers entire ecosystems. Without producers capturing energy from the sun, no other life could exist on Earth. They provide the energy base upon which all other trophic levels depend. Trophic level 2 contains primary consumers, the herbivores. These organisms feed exclusively on producers, obtaining energy by digesting plant material. Examples include cows munching grass, caterpillars devouring leaves, and tiny organisms such as zooplankton consuming algae in oceans. Primary consumers are called primary because they're the first consumers in the food chain, directly accessing energy stored by producers. They've evolved specialized digestive systems to break down tough plant materials like cellulose, extracting nutrients that carnivores couldn't access directly. Trophic level 3 contains secondary consumers, carnivores that prey upon herbivores. These predators, including foxes hunting rabbits, birds catching caterpillars, and small fish eating zooplankton, obtain energy by consuming primary consumers. The energy these carnivores obtain originated from sunlight captured by plants, then passed through herbivores. With each transfer, substantial energy is lost through respiration, movement, and heat production, making less energy available at higher levels. Trophic level 4 contains tertiary consumers that eat other carnivores. These high level predators, such as eagles catching snakes, polar bears hunting seals, or sharks consuming smaller predatory fish, sit near the top of food chains. They require large territories or ranges because the available energy at this level supports fewer individuals. Some carnivores have no natural predators except humans and occupy the highest trophic level in their ecosystems. These apex predators, like lions, orcas, and crocodiles, regulate prey populations and maintain ecosystem balance through top-down control. Food chains rarely extend beyond 4 trophic levels because energy losses at each transfer are substantial. Approximately 90% of energy is lost between levels through respiration, movement, and heat production, leaving insufficient energy to support additional levels. Decomposers operate outside the traditional trophic level structure but remain essential. Bacteria and fungi decompose dead organisms from all trophic levels, breaking down complex organic matter into simple compounds. They secrete digestive enzymes into their surroundings, breaking down proteins, carbohydrates, and fats into small, soluble molecules. These molecules then diffuse into decomposer cells, providing them with nutrients while simultaneously releasing minerals back into soil or water. This recycling process ensures nutrients remain available for producers, completing the nutrient cycle. Without decomposers, dead organisms would accumulate, locking away nutrients indefinitely. Ecosystems would eventually collapse as producers exhausted available minerals, demonstrating decomposers' critical ecological role. Understanding trophic levels reveals how energy flows through ecosystems and illustrates organisms' interdependence. Each level depends on those below it for energy, creating complex webs of feeding relationships. In this brief episode, we will discuss the pyramids of biomass and what determines their structure. Pyramids of biomass show the total mass of living material at each trophic level in a food chain. Each horizontal bar relates to the combined biomass of all organisms at that particular feeding level. As you move further up in trophic levels in a food chain, there's less and less energy and biomass at each stage. This pattern happens because energy is lost at each transfer between the trophic levels, supporting fewer organisms and less total mass as you move up. This energy loss explains why food chains rarely exceed 4 levels. With such inefficient transfers, there's simply not enough energy remaining to support additional trophic levels beyond the fourth or fifth. Consider the following woodland food chain. A simplified example might be that 1,000 plants might support 100 caterpillars, which sustain 10 birds, and finally, those support a single eagle. The total mass of plants exceeds the combined mass of caterpillars, and this pattern continues. Counting individual organisms can be deceptive. Imagine 100 fleas feeding on the eagle. Though greater in numbers, the fleas' combined biomass remains tiny compared to their host. Understanding pyramids of biomass helps ecologists assess ecosystem health and stability. Changes in biomass at one level can predict impacts throughout the food chain, making these diagrams valuable for conservation planning. These pyramids also explain why large predators require extensive territories. Supporting a single top predator requires enormous amounts of producer biomass at the pyramid's base. This episode of our series builds on the previous one. We'll quickly revise what biomass is, then look at why biomass is lost at each trophic level, and finally, how to calculate biomass transfer efficiency. Consider the journey of energy through a simple food chain. Grass grows using sunlight, cattle eat grass for growth, and humans consume beef. At each step, substantial energy disappears. The cattle use most of their consumed biomass for their own survival, movement, and bodily functions. Additionally, not everything cattle eat can be digested and absorbed. This illustrates the fundamental reality of biomass transfer. It's an inherently wasteful process with massive losses at every stage. Biomass is the total mass of living material in organisms. This biomass transfers through food chains when organisms consume other organisms. However, biomass transfer between trophic levels is startlingly inefficient, with only about 10% passing to the next level. This means 90% of biomass is lost at each transfer, a staggering amount of waste. Why does such dramatic biomass loss occur between trophic levels? Multiple biological processes contribute to this inefficiency, each representing energy that cannot pass up the food chain. First, organisms rarely consume every part of their prey or food source. Herbivores might avoid woody stems, thorns, or roots, whilst carnivores often leave bones, fur, or feathers uneaten. These inedible portions represent biomass that never enters the consumer's body. Even when dealing with apparently edible material, structural components like cellulose in plants prove difficult for many animals to digest. The digestive system cannot break down everything consumed, and undigested material passes through as feces. This waste exits the food chain entirely, returning nutrients to decomposers rather than passing to higher trophic levels. Third, absorbed biomass gets metabolized for various life processes, producing waste products. Respiration uses glucose for energy, releasing carbon dioxide and water as byproducts that cannot be recaptured by the organism. Animals use substantial energy for movement, maintaining body temperature, and other metabolic activities. Warm-blooded animals particularly lose enormous amounts of energy as heat, which dissipates into the environment. Protein metabolism produces nitrogen-based waste excreted as urea in urine. This represents another pathway through which biomass leaves the food chain, carrying away materials that required energy to process. We can calculate biomass transfer efficiency using a straightforward formula. Consider a pond ecosystem with algae, water fleas, small fish, and large fish. The numbers shown represent biomass available at each trophic level. To calculate biomass loss between levels, subtract the biomass at the higher level from that at the lower level. Between algae and water fleas, 364 kilograms is lost. Transfer efficiency equals biomass transferred divided by biomass available multiplied by 100. For algae to water fleas, there is a 9% transfer efficiency. This calculation reveals that only 9% of algal biomass transfers to water fleas. Similar calculations for other levels would show comparably low efficiencies, typically ranging from 5% to 20%. These low efficiencies explain fundamental ecological patterns. Food chains rarely exceed 4 levels because insufficient energy remains to support additional trophic levels. By the fourth level, only about 0.01% of the original solar energy remains available. This also explains why organism numbers generally decrease at higher trophic levels. Supporting 1 kilogram of large fish requires thousands of kilograms of algae at the base of the food chain. apex predators like eagles or sharks are necessarily rare because the energy available at their trophic level can support only small populations. Their rarity isn't accidental, but mathematically inevitable given biomass transfer inefficiencies. Understanding biomass transfer reveals why protecting primary producers is crucial for ecosystem stability. Damage to producer populations cascades up food chains, with effects magnified by the 90% loss at each level. In this episode of our series, we're covering a variety of topics. We'll begin by understanding food security and the complex factors threatening it worldwide, how overfishing depletes ocean resources, modern farming techniques, and finally, we'll consider the ethical implications of intensive farming. Food security means having reliable access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food for an active, healthy life. It encompasses not just food availability, but also accessibility, affordability, and nutritional adequacy. A population can have food security even if they import much of their food, provided supply chains remain stable and people can afford adequate nutrition. Unfortunately, numerous factors threaten food security globally, creating vulnerabilities that affect billions of people. Understanding these threats is essential for developing effective solutions to ensure everyone has access to adequate nutrition. Population growth represents a fundamental challenge to food security, particularly in developing nations where birth rates remain high. The global population is expanding rapidly, requiring increased food production from essentially the same agricultural land area. This creates mounting pressure on agricultural systems already stretched to capacity. Changing dietary patterns in developed countries compound this challenge through increased demand for resource intensive foods. As incomes rise, populations typically consume more meat, dairy, and processed foods, which require far more resources to produce than plant based diets. Additionally, globalization means food produced in developing countries increasingly gets exported to wealthier nations. This international trade can improve farmers' incomes but may reduce local food availability, creating food insecurity even in agriculturally productive regions. Agricultural production faces constant threats from pests and pathogens that can devastate crops and livestock. New diseases emerge regularly through mutation or geographic spread, whilst climate change enables pests to expand into previously inhospitable regions. A single outbreak can destroy entire harvests, as seen with locust swarms in East Africa or African swine fever in Asia. These biological threats can trigger widespread famine in regions with limited resources for pest control or disease management. Environmental changes increasingly disrupt traditional farming patterns worldwide. Droughts, floods, and extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and severe due to climate change. When monsoons fail or unexpected frosts occur, millions can face food shortages as crops fail and livestock perish. Rising temperatures alter growing seasons and shift suitable agricultural zones, forcing farmers to adapt or abandon traditional crops. Coastal agricultural areas face saltwater intrusion from rising sea levels, reducing productive land area. The high costs of modern farming create barriers to food production in many regions. Machinery, fertilizers, pesticides, and irrigation systems require a large investment that small scale farmers often cannot afford. This economic barrier means many communities cannot increase production despite having suitable land and climate. Without access to modern techniques, they remain vulnerable to crop failures and cannot produce surpluses for market sale. Armed conflicts devastate food security by disrupting production, distribution, and access. Wars destroy farming infrastructure and relocate farming populations, thereby preventing cultivation even where environmental conditions remain suitable. Conflict zones often experience severe food shortages as supply chains collapse and humanitarian access becomes restricted. Water conflicts particularly threaten food security, as farming consumes approximately 70% of global fresh water. Disputes over river access or groundwater extraction can leave entire regions unable to irrigate crops. Overfishing represents another critical threat to global food security, particularly for coastal populations dependent on marine protein. Fish stocks worldwide are declining due to industrial fishing methods that harvest fish faster than populations can reproduce. Many commercially important species face potential collapse. North Atlantic cod exemplifies this crisis, with populations crashing to near extinction levels despite once supporting massive fisheries. Similar declines affect tuna, sharks, and numerous other species that require decades to reach reproductive maturity. Overfishing disrupts entire marine ecosystems by removing key predators or prey species. This can trigger cascading effects throughout ocean food webs, potentially causing irreversible ecological changes. Sustainable fishing practices offer solutions by maintaining fish stocks at levels supporting continued reproduction. This requires careful management based on scientific assessment of population changes and ecosystem interactions. Fishing quotas establish limits on catch quantities and fish sizes for specific areas and seasons. These regulations prevent overharvesting whilst allowing younger fish to reach breeding age before capture. Net design modifications significantly reduce unsustainable fishing impacts. Larger mesh sizes allow juvenile or younger fish to escape, ensuring they survive to reproduce before entering the fishery. This simple change can dramatically improve population sustainability whilst maintaining commercial viability. Reducing bycatch, the unintended capture of non target species, protects ecosystem diversity. Modified nets and fishing techniques can minimize capture of dolphins, turtles, and other vulnerable species often killed in fishing operations. Modern farming techniques aim to increase production efficiency by controlling energy transfer within agricultural systems. By minimizing energy losses to the environment, more energy becomes available for producing food. Intensive animal farming restricts animal movement within controlled environments, reducing energy spent on movement. Temperature regulation in these facilities prevents energy loss through thermoregulation, allowing more consumed energy to support growth. These efficiency gains come with significant ethical considerations. Animals in intensive systems often live in cramped conditions. Chickens may never see daylight, whilst pigs cannot express natural behaviors like nest building. Disease spreads rapidly in crowded conditions, necessitating routine antibiotic use that contributes to antimicrobial resistance. This creates public health risks beyond immediate animal welfare concerns. High protein feeds accelerate growth but may cause skeletal problems in rapidly growing animals. Broiler chickens often cannot support their own weight by slaughter age, experiencing pain and mobility issues. Fish farming presents similar challenges, with salmon kept in sea cages at densities far exceeding natural conditions. Parasites and diseases spread quickly, requiring chemical treatments that can affect wild populations. Society must balance productivity needs against ethical responsibilities. Some argue that intensive farming is necessary to feed growing populations affordably. They emphasize that without these methods, food prices would rise beyond many people's means, creating worse welfare outcomes overall. Others contend that animal suffering cannot be justified by economic efficiency. They advocate for higher welfare standards even if this increases costs, arguing that society should prioritize compassion over cheap food. Alternative approaches seek middle ground between intensive production and extensive systems. These include free range farming and rotational grazing, which improves welfare whilst maintaining reasonable productivity. Precision farming uses technology to optimize resource use without animal restriction. GPS guided machinery, soil sensors, and drone monitoring enable farmers to apply exactly what crops need, reducing waste whilst maintaining yields. International cooperation remains essential for addressing food security challenges as fish populations migrate across national boundaries, making conservation efforts by individual countries ineffective. Individual choices also influence food system sustainability through purchasing decisions and consumption patterns. Reducing food waste, choosing sustainably produced foods, and moderating meat consumption can collectively reduce pressure on agricultural systems. As populations continue growing and climate change intensifies, achieving food security whilst preserving environmental resources becomes increasingly challenging. Success requires integrating technological innovation, policy reform, and behavioral change across all levels of society. In this episode of our series, we'll take a look at what biotechnology is, mycoprotein, genetically engineered bacteria, and finally, we'll explore genetically modified crops. Biotechnology involves manipulating living organisms and biological processes to create useful products. Modern biotechnology enables scientists to culture vast quantities of microorganisms under precisely controlled industrial conditions. These organisms, grown in large fermentation vessels, produce valuable substances ranging from food ingredients to life-saving medicines. Let's examine mycoprotein, a protein-rich food product derived from fungi that's becoming increasingly important as a sustainable meat alternative. The most well-known example uses Fusarium venenatum, grown on glucose-rich nutrients in aerobic conditions within temperature-controlled fermentation tanks. The fungus converts simple sugars into protein-rich biomass remarkably efficiently. After fermentation, the fungal culture undergoes heat treatment to reduce harmful RNA content. Then filtration and further alterations create products with meat-like texture. The resulting mycoprotein contains approximately 45% protein by dry weight, plus essential amino acids and dietary fiber. This production method offers substantial environmental advantages over conventional meat production. Mycoprotein requires 90% less land and water than beef production, whilst generating 90% fewer greenhouse gas emissions. For every kilogram of mycoprotein produced, only 1.5 kilograms of glucose are required, demonstrating exceptional feed conversion efficiency. Compare this to beef production, which requires approximately 10 kilograms of feed per kilogram of meat. Biotechnology has also revolutionized medicine through microbial production of human proteins. Consider human insulin production, which transformed diabetes treatment worldwide. Before genetic engineering, insulin was extracted from pig and cattle pancreases, causing allergic reactions in some patients and requiring enormous numbers of animals. Scientists now insert the human insulin gene into bacteria, typically E. coli, which then produce human identical insulin. The bacteria multiply rapidly in fermentation tanks, creating vast quantities of insulin that's purified and formulated into medicine. This process ensures consistent supply, reduces production costs, and eliminates animal derived contaminants. Similar techniques produce human growth hormone for treating growth disorders, clotting factors for hemophilia, and numerous other therapeutic proteins. The precision of genetic engineering enables targeted solutions to specific medical needs. Genetically modified crops represent another significant biotechnology application addressing global food security. Scientists can introduce specific traits like drought resistance, pest resistance, or enhanced nutrition directly into crop genomes. Golden rice exemplifies nutritional biofortification containing genes that produce beta carotene, a vitamin A precursor. This addresses vitamin A deficiency affecting millions in developing countries, potentially preventing blindness and reducing child mortality. Bt cotton and Bt maize contain genes from Bacillus thuringiensis bacteria, producing proteins toxic to specific insect pests but harmless to humans. Farmers growing these crops report 30 to 80% reductions in pesticide applications, improving both environmental outcomes and farmer health. However, GM crops generate significant controversy and debate worldwide. Multiple concerns exist regarding their environmental, social, and economic impacts. Critics argue that hunger results primarily from poverty and inequality rather than insufficient food production. They contend that addressing economic disparities would more effectively tackle lack of nutrition than technological solutions. Environmental concerns include potential gene flow to wild relatives, creating superweeds resistant to herbicides. There's also worry about impacts on non target organisms like monarch butterflies affected by Bt crop pollen. Additionally, GM crops cannot overcome fundamental agricultural challenges like severely degraded soils or extreme weather. Even engineered drought resistance has limits when facing prolonged water scarcity or degraded land. Corporate control over GM seeds raises socioeconomic concerns. Large biotechnology companies own patents on GM varieties, requiring farmers to purchase new seeds annually rather than saving them. This creates dependency and can increase farming costs, particularly affecting farmers in developing nations. Some worry that biotechnology diverts attention from simpler, less expensive approaches that might provide more sustainable solutions. Traditional breeding, crop rotation, and integrated pest management could address many agricultural challenges without genetic modification. Despite controversies, biotechnology continues advancing rapidly, offering tools to address food security, nutrition, and health challenges. Success requires careful regulation, transparent communication, and consideration of both benefits and risks.